My name is Anna. I am 34 years old. I live in a quiet suburb outside New York City, and I work as a senior operations coordinator for a regional logistics firm. On paper, my life looks stable, organized, and unremarkable, which is exactly why no one questioned my marriage until it was far too late. Right now, my husband Ethan is standing under bright lights at a corporate event, smiling for cameras, believing he has finally secured everything he deserves. What he does not know is that in less than 1 hour I will sign documents that will erase his future, and I will do it without raising my voice. I met Ethan 8 years ago when ambition still sounded like love. He was charming, disciplined, and careful with his words, the kind of man who made promises feel logical instead of romantic. I believed we were building something together, even when I noticed how carefully he kept parts of himself locked away. I told myself that marriage meant patience. I told myself that trust was proven by silence. We married in a small ceremony attended by colleagues, not friends. His family praised my reliability more than my personality, and I mistook that for acceptance. I supported his career quietly, adjusted my own schedule, signed paperwork without questions, and learned how to disappear inside my own life. If you had asked me then, I would have said I was happy. I would have said that love matured into calm. The truth arrived slowly, then all at once. It came through fragments, a name mentioned too softly, hotel charges that never matched conferences, and a pattern of absences that no explanation could fully erase. Claire was not an accident or a mistake. She was a plan that existed before me, during me, and after me. I was never the choice. I was the structure that made his real life possible. I did not confront him. I did not cry on the bathroom floor or demand answers I already had. Instead, I listened. I watched. I learned how our finances worked, how my signatures had been used, and how much he believed I would never notice. There is a specific kind of humiliation that sharpens the mind. It turns grief into precision. Tonight, Ethan believes he is celebrating a promotion that will finally place him above everyone who ever doubted him. Claire believes she is waiting for the moment he will publicly choose her. Neither of them knows that I have already chosen myself. If you discovered that your entire marriage was only a backup plan, would you leave quietly, or would you stay long enough to make the truth cost something? This is not a story about rage or forgiveness. It is about awareness, timing, and consequences. I stayed because silence gave me leverage, and patience gave me power. By the time the applause fades, they will understand that being underestimated is not mercy. It is preparation for what comes next. I did not wake up one morning and realize I was a spare wife. That kind of truth does not arrive with drama. It seeps in quietly, the way cold air slips through a crack you pretend is not there. At first, it was small things that I trained myself to ignore because ignoring them felt like being mature. Ethan never said my name when he talked about the future. He said we in public, but in private his plans were always framed around what he needed, what his career required, what his next step demanded. I told myself that was ambition, not exclusion. I told myself that love did not need to be loud to be real. I worked full-time and still made my life flexible around his. I learned his routines better than my own. I knew which days he liked silence, which nights he claimed exhaustion, which weekends were suddenly filled with work obligations. When you live with someone long enough, you stop questioning patterns because patterns become comfort. Or maybe they become cages and you stop noticing the bars. The first crack appeared during a dinner with his colleagues. One of them joked about how lucky Ethan was to have someone steady at home. Someone who handled the boring parts of life so he could focus on bigger things. Everyone laughed, including Ethan. I smiled because that was my role. Inside, something tightened. Steady was not a compliment. It was a classification. I noticed how rarely he touched me unless someone else was watching, how affection became performance instead of instinct. At night, he slept facing away from me, his phone always within reach, screen down, notifications muted. When I asked about it once, he laughed and said I was overthinking. I apologized for even asking. Claire's name appeared by accident. It slipped out of his mouth during a story he quickly corrected. replacing it with a client, and then changing the subject entirely. I would have missed it if I had not been paying attention, but by then, attention was all I had. Once you notice the first inconsistency, your mind starts collecting them without permission. There were receipts that did not match travel schedules, gifts I never saw but knew were purchased, and a version of Ethan that only appeared when he thought I was not listening. His voice softened in phone calls he took in the other room. He laughed differently. I learned the sound of his real happiness without ever being part of it. I did not confront him because confrontation requires hope that the truth will change something. By the time the evidence aligned, hope was already gone. What I felt instead was clarity, clean, sharp, and terrifying in how calm it made me. I began reviewing documents I had signed over the years, not because I suspected betrayal, but because I wanted to understand the structure of my own life. The more I read, the more I realized how often my trust had been translated into authority he did not deserve. I had been convenient, legally, financially, emotionally. I was the quiet constant that allowed him to gamble with everything else. The realization hurt, but not in the way movies portray. There were no dramatic breakdowns. The pain was internal and methodical, like something being dismantled piece by piece. I stopped seeing myself as a wife and started seeing myself as an asset that had been misused. That shift changed everything. I watched Ethan with new eyes. I noticed how confident he was in my silence, how certain he seemed that I would always choose peace over truth. That assumption was his greatest mistake. Silence is not submission. Sometimes it is surveillance. At work, I stayed the same. Competent, reliable, invisible in the way people overlook women who do not demand attention. That invisibility followed me home, and I let it. I let him believe nothing had changed. I let him plan his future without realizing I was no longer included in it. Late at night, I asked myself questions I had avoided for years. When did I start shrinking? When did love become management? When did I stop expecting to be chosen? The answers were uncomfortable, but they were mine. Owning them felt like the first honest thing I had done in a long time. I did not hate Claire. That surprised me. She was not the villain I had imagined. She was simply the person he wanted when convenience was not required. Understanding that stripped the situation of romance and left only responsibility. His, and now, mine. By the time Ethan mentioned his upcoming promotion, I already knew what it meant. More exposure, more leverage, more assumptions about loyalty and support. He kissed my forehead and thanked me for always being there. I almost laughed at how easy it was for him to confuse presence with permission. That night, I opened a new folder on my computer. I labeled it nothing. No emotion, no meaning, just records, dates, and patterns. This was not revenge. Revenge is loud and reckless. What I was preparing required patience. That was the moment I stopped being confused. I was not abandoned. I was positioned. And for the first time since our wedding day, I understood exactly what I needed to do next. I thought clarity would make the pain disappear. It did not. It simply changed its shape. Instead of sharp confusion, it became a steady pressure that followed me everywhere, even into moments that once felt safe. I smiled at Ethan when he spoke. I listened when he complained about work. I nodded when he talked about the future as if I were still part of it. Every word felt like a test I was passing too well. I did not rush. Rushing is what people do when they want relief. I did not want relief. I wanted understanding. I wanted to know exactly how deep the damage went and how much of myself had been quietly leveraged without my consent. So I slowed everything down and began paying attention to details I had once considered beneath me. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer under the excuse of updating my will. His name was Michael, and he did not ask emotional questions. He asked factual ones: dates, documents, access, ownership. Sitting across from him in a neutral office, I realized how rarely anyone had ever asked me what I controlled. Not what I supported, not what I enabled, what I actually owned. Michael did not react when I explained my suspicions. He listened and took notes, his expression steady. When I finished, He asked one question that changed the trajectory of everything. He asked whether I wanted truth or resolution. I understood immediately that I could not have both. I chose truth. Over the next weeks, my evenings became quiet investigations. I reviewed joint accounts, traced transfers, and learned the language of fine print. I discovered how easily trust becomes permission when it is never questioned. Ethan had not needed to hide much because he had never expected me to look. That arrogance saved me time. The more I uncovered, the less emotional I became. Betrayal loses its power when it turns into data. Dates replaced memories. Numbers replaced feelings. Patterns replaced doubt. I saw how my consistency had funded his risks, how my predictability had protected his secrets. I had been the firewall between him and consequence. There were nights when grief tried to return, usually when he slept beside me, breathing evenly, his hand resting near mine but never quite touching. In those moments, I reminded myself that the person I missed never fully existed. I was mourning a version of him that had only lived in my assumptions. That realization hurt more than the affair itself. I watched Ethan prepare for his promotion with a confidence that bordered on carelessness. He talked openly about future plans, about visibility and influence, about how everything was finally aligning. He thanked me often. That gratitude felt rehearsed, like a habit he had learned rather than an emotion he felt. I accepted it without comment. Claire remained a shadow, present only through implications and omissions. I never searched for her. I did not need to see her face to understand her role. She was the reward he believed he had earned. I was the infrastructure that made the reward possible. Understanding that distinction removed any temptation to compete. Michael called me one afternoon and asked if I was ready to move from observation to preparation. I said yes without hesitation. We discussed timing, optics, and impact. He reminded me that the law is not emotional, but it is precise. Precision favors those who wait. I began organizing my findings into order, not for revenge, but for accuracy. Each document had a place. Each email was archived. Each signature was catalogued. I did not feel powerful while doing this. I felt focused. Focus is quieter and far more dangerous. Ethan sensed nothing. That was the most unsettling part. He kissed me goodbye every morning and came home late without explanation. He assumed my silence meant acceptance. He assumed my calm meant weakness. That assumption was a gift I did not correct. There was a moment, late one night, when he asked me if I was happy. The question startled me with its timing, not its sincerity. I looked at him and realized he genuinely believed happiness was something he could offer retroactively. I told him I was fine. The lie slid easily between us. As the date of his public announcement approached, my internal clock shifted. Every conversation felt like a countdown. Every shared meal felt symbolic. I was no longer living inside the marriage. I was standing just outside it, watching it operate without me. Michael confirmed that everything was in place. The steps were legal. The outcome was unavoidable. All that remained was the moment of execution. I slept better after that. Knowing the end allows the mind to rest. On the night before the event, Ethan laid out his suit and asked me which tie looked better. I helped him choose the one that photographed well. There was no anger in the gesture, only completion. I was closing a chapter that had never been written in my handwriting. When he fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room and reflected on the woman I had been when I first married him. She believed love was endurance. She believed silence was strength. I did not blame her. She had done the best she could with the information she had. The woman I was now understood something different. Endurance without respect is erosion. Silence without strategy is surrender. But silence with intention is control. By the time morning arrived, my grief had transformed into resolve. I was no longer reacting to betrayal. I was responding to truth. And the truth was simple. Ethan believed the spotlight would protect him. He did not understand that the brighter the light, the clearer the shadows. Everything was ready. The day of the event arrived with unsettling normalcy. Ethan left early, confident and distracted, already halfway into the future he believed was guaranteed. I watched him from the doorway as he adjusted his jacket. kissed my cheek, and reminded me not to forget the time of the live stream. He wanted me watching. He wanted my presence even when I was not physically there. I promised I would not miss it. Once the door closed, the house felt lighter, as if it had been holding its breath for years and had finally exhaled. I dressed carefully, not elegantly, not dramatically, just deliberately. Neutral colors, clean lines, nothing that suggested emotion. This was not a confrontation, it was a conclusion. Michael met me near the venue an hour before the announcement. He did not ask how I felt, he asked if I was ready. That difference mattered. I nodded and handed him the final authorization. There was no shaking in my hands. By then, fear had burned itself out, leaving only focus behind. The ballroom was full of applause and expectation. Ethan stood at the center of it all, relaxed, practiced, entirely convinced of his momentum. I did not approach him. I did not need to. Timing was no longer about proximity, it was about sequence. When his name was announced and the room erupted, I took my seat in the back, unnoticed, exactly where I needed to be. I watched him smile, watched the confidence settle into his posture, watched him accept congratulations that had already expired. There is a strange peace that comes from knowing something others do not. It is not joy, it is clarity. Michael moved first. Paperwork was submitted, accounts frozen, contingencies activated. The law does not arrive with drama. It arrives quietly, efficiently, and without apology. By the time Ethan stepped down from the stage, the structure beneath him was already dissolving. I saw the moment when confusion replaced pride. It was subtle, just a flicker, but I recognized it. Phones began to buzz. Whispers replaced applause. Claire was not there, but her absence suddenly felt loud. He checked his messages, frowned, and looked toward the exits as if searching for something that had vanished. I stood and walked out before he could find me. I did not want his reaction. I did not need it. Closure does not require witnesses. It requires completion. Outside, the air was cool and grounding. My phone vibrated once. A message from Ethan. One sentence. One question. I did not open it. Some conversations end before they begin. Over the next hours, the fallout unfolded without my involvement. Contracts were suspended. Investigations initiated. Opportunities evaporated. The future he had described so confidently folded in on itself, not because of revenge, but because of exposure. The truth does not need embellishment. It only needs space. When I returned home later that night, the house felt unfamiliar. Not because anything had changed, but because I had. I packed slowly, choosing only what belonged to me. There was no anger in the process, just discernment. I left behind everything that had required me to be smaller. Ethan came home just before midnight. He looked disoriented, like someone who had run into a wall he insisted was not there. He asked what was happening. I told him the truth, briefly and without accusation. I explained what I had learned, what I had done, and why it was irreversible. He tried to speak, but there was nothing left to negotiate. The marriage had ended long before this conversation. We were simply acknowledging it now. He asked me how long I had known. I told him the date. He sat down when he heard it. That was the only moment I felt something close to satisfaction, not because he was hurting, but because he finally understood that my silence had never been ignorance. I left before dawn. There was no dramatic goodbye, no speech, just a door closing behind me, softly but permanently. Weeks later, the noise settled. His name stopped appearing in places it once dominated. Claire disappeared from his life as predictably as she had entered it. I did not follow the details. They no longer belonged to me. I moved into a smaller place with more light. I slept better. I spoke less and meant more. People noticed the change and mistook it for resilience. It was not resilience. It was relief. Sometimes I think about the woman I was when I believed being chosen was the highest form of validation. I do not judge her. She was surviving with limited information. I am grateful she stayed long enough for me to learn what she could not see. This story is not about punishment. It is about accuracy, about understanding the difference between loyalty and erasure. about recognizing when silence is no longer protection but permission. If you are reading this and wondering what you would do in my place, I cannot answer that for you. I can only tell you this. Being the spare does not mean you are replaceable. It means someone else was afraid to choose you honestly. I chose myself instead. The quiet that followed surprised me more than the collapse itself. I expected noise, explanations, echoes of what had happened. Instead, there was space. Mornings without tension, evenings without anticipation or disappointment. For the first time in years, my thoughts belonged to me alone, uninterrupted and honest. People asked how I felt, usually in lowered voices, as if emotion required discretion. I told them I felt calm. Some mistook that for denial. Others assumed strength. Neither was accurate. Calm was simply the absence of pretending. I was no longer managing someone else's comfort or minimizing my own reality to keep a fragile structure standing. Ethan tried to reach out more than once. The messages shifted from confusion to regret to nostalgia. I did not respond. Not out of cruelty, but because responding would have implied a conversation that no longer existed. Closure does not always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like distance that remains intact. I learned something important in the aftermath. Love that requires you to disappear is not love. It is convenience disguised as commitment. I had confused endurance with loyalty and silence with grace. Walking away taught me that self-respect is not loud, but it is immovable once claimed. There were moments when doubt crept in, usually late at night, when memory softened the past and tried to negotiate with the present. In those moments, I reminded myself why I stayed as long as I did. I stayed because I believed in fairness. I stayed because I needed proof, not excuses. I stayed until the truth was undeniable and my footing was secure. Leaving without understanding would have haunted me. Leaving with clarity set me free. My life did not transform into something cinematic. There was no dramatic reinvention. What changed was subtler and more profound. I stopped shrinking. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped mistaking being needed for being valued. That shift altered everything else naturally. I began choosing differently. Friends who listened instead of dismissed. Work that recognized contribution instead of consuming it. Silence that felt restorative instead of heavy. Each choice reinforced the same lesson. Being chosen by yourself is not a consolation prize. It is the foundation everything else stands on. If you have ever felt like the background to someone else's story, I want you to understand this. You are not invisible. You have simply been standing in a place that benefits from you not being seen. Awareness changes that. Boundaries change that. Timing changes that. This is not a story about winning. It is a story about refusing to lose yourself quietly. About recognizing when love has turned into erasure and having the courage to step out of it without apology. I did not destroy anyone. I removed myself from a system that depended on my silence. If you were in my position, would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace? Or would you have waited until the truth could no longer be ignored and let it reshape everything? I do not believe there is one correct answer, but I do believe this. Being the spare does not define your worth, accepting it does. And the moment you stop accepting it, your life becomes yours again.